Good morning. As we're gathering, I know that there will be others drifting in, but I just want to take a very few minutes to welcome you. Some of you who are new here, welcome. And to those of you who have come back, we especially welcome and celebrate you. And the reason we celebrate you is because if we were in a factory making widgets, we'd be able to see our end product coming off the production line, and we'd be able to chart our sales. And if we were winemakers, we'd be able to test the virtue of the grapes and taste what had happened. But because our call is to create an atmosphere where people can find their way in ministry, to honor their own calls, we don't get an opportunity to see the fruit of what we have put out until you return and tell us what's happened, how it's happened, and how God is blessing your life. What we believe at this point at United, I know you've heard through our mailings and other things, that everything is new again. And what I want you to know is that we hold our legacy as sacred trust. The reasons that we read the names of those who have gone on is because it is upon their shoulders that we stand. We honor that trust. We will not betray that trust, but we're also called toward the future to imagine and reimagine what we can be and how we can enliven our culture, our society, and our world. And so we have a new mission, vision, and values, which emanates from the very essence of who we have always been and points to who we can be. We have new professors hired and others who have retired. The changes are not just internal, they're also external. The Pew Institute, the Auburn Institute tell us that the people who will be coming for education in seminaries are seekers. They are looking for different pathways. Some are headed right toward the church and the pulpit. Others don't know what God has called them to do yet. And so we are the ground where they plant their seeds, and it is our task to nurture them, even though none of us knows what the end is going to be. So our plans for the future include these seismic shifts in culture. We have to be in the future innovative and fluid enough to respond to the needs of the people who are coming and to respond to the call of God. This is a sacred trust. It requires that we take care of ourselves, for we are also earth. It requires that we bless and enliven our institutions, for these institutions are the manifestation of God's will on earth, one portion of it at least. And it is also a sacred trust that we take care of our earth. And the reason that we're focusing on earth is because United cares about it. We have our prairies, we have our bees, we are building a brick oven for community bread baking. We are going to be having beer and theology sessions where some of the honey that we make on our campus will be used to make beer. And we'll be meeting people where they are in the bars to talk about faith and spirituality. So United is focus inwardly as we discern what God would have us do. And it's focused outwardly as we begin to serve the community that we live in and reach out to the world. So thank you for listening, and I want to introduce now the Vice President of Academic Affairs, Dean Sharon Tan, who will introduce our speaker.
Good morning and welcome. I'd like to introduce Dr. Carlton Waterhouse. Dr. Waterhouse is another JD PhD that makes 3 of us in a row right now. And we are taking over the world. He is a professor of law just at Indiana University's Robert H. McKinney School of Law. Holds a PhD in religion with a concentration in ethics from Emory University. Professor Waterhouse is nationally recognized for his work on environmental justice, and is known internationally for his research and writing on reparations and state human rights violations. He went to college at Pennsylvania State University, where he studied engineering and ethics of technology before going to law school at Howard University School of Law. After law school, he joined the United States Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, where he served both in Washington, D.C. and in Atlanta. Following a successful 9-year career with the EPA, Dr. Waterhouse answered a call of some type. Along the way, he had become an AME pastor, and now he enrolled in the Master's of Theology at Emory, and then the PhD program in social ethics. It was there at Emory that I met him and his wife Sonia and his children Nia and Joshua. Carlton and I had a conversation at about the end of our program. He was about a year behind me, I think. I think I was your TA, if I remember correctly. And sometime toward the end, I think maybe I had just graduated, or I was about to graduate, or maybe we talked about what we would do with our JD PhDs. Carlton actually wanted to teach in a seminary. And I didn't know what I wanted to do. So Carlton, who wanted to teach in a seminary, wound up teaching in a law school. And I, who didn't know what I wanted to do, wound up here. But despite being a professor in a law school, Dr. Waterhouse has continued the call of God on his life for him to proclaim justice, healing, and reconciliation. Thank you for coming, Dr. Waterhouse, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Dean Tan, and thank you so much, President Holmes, and to all of the alums and students and those who are all part of this great institution and this community. Greetings and welcome to you all. And I so much appreciate this opportunity to be here with you all on this wonderful morning. As I arrived yesterday, I also have to thank Philip. Where's Philip? Where are you, Philip? Okay, there you are. I also have to thank Philip, who picked me up yesterday and has been a wonderful host. I was mentioning to him that when I arrived yesterday, somewhat delayed, maybe about 4 or 5 hours because of bad weather in Chicago, that I had thought that the weather had warmed here in Minnesota. And so I hadn't brought a coat or a hat or anything, so I was scrambling in the airport to find a hat. And so I have a beautiful green knit Minnesota hat to show I'm a fan of hockey, and even more so a fan of warmth, since I don't have a whole lot on my head to protect me from the cold. And so it was great, though, to arrive here in the city, and so great to be here. And I've been able to even keep warm with Philip's wonderful help and the heat in the car. With that said, my opportunity today I am going to use to talk to you all about some very important matters that we have. And unlike a Baptist preacher who would pull out a watch and put it down on the podium in front of him and then ignore it for the rest of the time, I'm going to pull out my phone in front of me and ignore it for the rest of the time. So I'm going to use this opportunity to talk about some very important issues that we face today, primarily around the questions of environmental ethics and environmental justice. But before I step into that, let me commend you all on your envisioning of this institution. I was looking over the sheet that you have in the materials that lay out the mission and the vision and the values of the school, and I wanted to highlight a couple of the values that I thought were so important, that also I thought were so relevant to my talk today. One of them was the idea of the lifelong learning, and that's such an essential part of our human journey, is that we continue to learn and we remain open to learn. The other one was the challenging conversations and bold partnerships for social for societal transformation. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that idea of bold conversations, bold partnerships and challenging conversations in just a moment. And then finally, promoting a just, peaceful, and sustainable world through stewardship and courageous action. Certainly, those are very commendable values and very essential values for us as we journey through life's way. Well, I'm not delivering a sermon. There was a wonderful sermon that had already been delivered, where there was a great deal of witnessing and testifying, and something that I was able to richly share in and enjoy. And so I'm going to be honest. I think that's where you got a heavy dose of eco-spirituality and eco-theology. Mine will probably be more along the lines of eco-sociology, but at the same time rooted in a certain theological context, right? And I want to begin by drawing attention to the idea of environmental ethics and environmental justice and the relationship between the two of them. And I believe, for me, that begins with who we are as people. Rather than rooting it abstractly somewhere else, I want to start very much with us as human beings, as a part of God's creation. A part of God's creation who, at least we speculate, unlike other parts of God's creation, have to figure out what we're supposed to do. Right? Who struggle with the idea of purpose and meaning and direction. Who struggle with the idea of how to live our lives in the right way, how to live morally in the world, how to live faithfully in the world. We postulate, we say animals don't have that struggle. They just are, right? They just exist, and they just carry out and live in a way that's consistent with their natural instinct. And that we as humanity, though, have this sense of struggle. And as a result of this sense of struggle, oftentimes in our own lives, in our individual lives, in our private lives, many of us live lives of quiet desperation. Lives that inwardly don't reflect the smiles that we offer outwardly. Lives where we are in crowds, yet feeling very alone. Right? And so we find this strange paradox in human life, where we feel as though in community we have meaning, we have purpose, and yet when we look at the interior lives, often we find ourselves struggling with a sense of who we are and what our role is to be. And I want to postulate that environmental ethics and environmental justice meet us right there. Meet us right there at those moments of quiet desperation. Meet us right there at those points of questioning. And I think there's helpful insight from the biblical text, particularly Isaiah chapter 58, around verses 4 through 12. That's a place where the writer is bringing to our attention how we are seeking to find God, right? How the Israelites were looking to find God through fasting and through declaring solemn times and solemn days in which they would deny their physical bodies the pleasures that otherwise they would enjoy of food. And how Isaiah said, Isaiah hears God saying, is this the fast that I've declared for you? Is this what you should do to hear from heaven, is to go through this sense of deprivation? Isn't what I have for you, isn't the fast I've declared for you to become repairers of the breach, restorers of past to dwell in, right? Isn't what I've called for you is to loose the bonds of injustice, to provide for those who are in need, to advocate on behalf of those who are voiceless? Isn't that the fast that I've called for you? Isn't that what you should do to hear from heaven? Right? Is to take on advocacy for those who need advocates, to become the voice for those who otherwise are unheard, to fight for justice in society. Isn't this the fast? And when you do that, won't you be renewed? Won't you find yourself refreshed from me? Won't you hear from heaven when you put yourself in the place of engaging and becoming salt, right? And Jesus tells us in Matthew 5:13, right? You're the salt of the earth. You're the salt of the earth, right? Salt not only adding flavor and distinctiveness, but as a preservative, right? Essentially as a preservative. Before we had our Kenmore refrigerators, right? Or even our ice boxes of old, right? Right? Salt is a preservative. Why? Because the meat is bound to spoil and decay and to rot. But the salt creates a special chemical bond with the water that slows that process of decay. We are called to be salt in human society. A society that is prone to decay and corrupt. But we're called to be the salt. And when we hook up with the Spirit, with the water, right? Something happens that helps to preserve that society. And so what does this have to do with environmental ethics and environmental justice, right? Well, I'll start off by saying, number one, when we look at the question of environmental ethics, we often are talking about the idea of ethics of humans in the natural community, right? We're talking about what is our relationship with nature and how do we engage as humans vis-a-vis the rest of the created order in a way that is ethical or moral, right? That's what we look at often when we think about environmental ethics. And then we think about environmental justice, and we're really talking about our relationship with other humans. And how do we engage with the rest of humanity in a way that is just with regards to the environment? This plays itself out in a multitude of ways, but I'll just highlight a couple. One is distribution. Distribution of resources in human communities, right? How do we distribute the goods of the community? How do we distribute the bads of the community? And often the goods and the bads are environmental in nature. How do we distribute clean air? How do we distribute clean water? Right? How do we distribute the polluted air? How do we distribute the dirty water? Right? How do we make toxins that spew out of massive factories available? Or how do we protect some from exposure while others bathe in it? Right? So environmental justice helps us understand our relationships as human beings with regards to the environment. And environmental ethics helps us understand our relationship as humans to the created order. So one way of thinking about it is sort of like a cross, right? And so on the horizontal of the cross, we have our relationships together as humans. And on the vertical of the cross, we have our relationship with the rest of the created order. And so if we put ourselves right at the juncture of those two relationships, that's how we do environmental justice. And that's how we do environmental ethics. The truth is, you can't have environmental ethics without environmental justice, because it won't be ethical. And you can't have environmental justice without environmental ethics. Because if you're engaged only in the just distribution of environmental resources among humans, and you're despoiling and degrading and destroying all of those resources, what difference does it make? And so when we think about environmental justice and we think about environmental ethics, we should be thinking about the juncture of these two ways of understanding who we are as human beings and how we can live in the world together. So let's take a moment and talk a little more about justice. Now, justice is a broad concept that has a lot of ways of thinking about it, but I want to narrow it very much through the work of some social psychiatrists. And these academics from Harvard and Cal Berkeley and University of Connecticut have developed a theory called social dominance. Some of you may be familiar with it. But the theory of social dominance is a really rich theory, and I want to encourage you to look at the book on social dominance as by title that explains the theory. It's a rich theory, and it basically says that in human communities, social dominance is almost universal. It's almost a universal reality that in human communities there are particular groups that tend to have dominance over other members of those human communities or societies. And it doesn't matter what the religious orientation of the society is. It doesn't matter what the economic system of the society is. It doesn't matter a lot of the different things that we think, whether it's industrialized or post-industrial or pre-industrial, these tend to hold constant. And they break these groups down and these levels of dominance down. They look particularly at the idea of how we have two recurring, constant, consistent hierarchies. One is age hierarchy, so that adults exert dominance against the young. It seems natural, but it's also an observable reality. Adults organize society around themselves, and they dominate the society. And the young are told to fit in to what the adults have decided. And they do so not as equal members of the community in decision-making or in participation, right? But the other level of dominance that they discuss is gender dominance, right? And so they find that consistently across our contemporary societies, there is male dominance over females, right? It's universalized across our contemporary societies. An example of a group that is then put in a subordinate position to another group, males, subordinating females. And then they say there's an arbitrary set dominance, which is really interesting, right? In other words, in one society it's one thing, in another society it's another thing. So in one society it could be the Shia over the Sunni Muslim. In another society it could be the Sunni Muslim over the Shia Muslim. In one society it could be ethnicity, one ethnic group over another ethnic group. It could be the Tutsis over the Hutu, or vice versa. It could be Zulus and Xhosa, right? It could be ethnicity, or it could be racial. It could be like American society, whites, and then everybody else. Group dominance, right? And this social dominance is a reality in human societies, and they're studying it, and their study helps us understand it because they don't just look at it at a kind of a meta-narrative kind of, perspective, but they bring a little bit of the postmodernist view, and they break it down and look at certain personality types and how certain personality types relate to dominance within a society. So you have those who have a certain social dominant orientation. You can be more hierarchical in your orientation or more egalitarian in your orientation. But anyway, so what does this all have to do with environmental justice and environmental ethics? Well, when we want to talk about the question of justice, we have to talk about dominance. Because in contemporary society, most injustice is about dominance. And I think that's really important and often forgotten, and it needs to be kept on the front burner. Why is that? Because we're often misled by red herrings that would cause us to think that injustice in society is rooted in individual acts of bias. Let's take a moment and talk about the Los Angeles Clippers. Just a moment. So we have an owner, a billionaire owner of a sports team, National Basketball Association team, the Los Angeles Clippers. A gentleman who goes by the name of Donald Sterling, who recently has been in the news pretty much for the whole 24-hour news cycle, I'm certain, because of comments that he made in a conversation with a young woman who has a relationship with him, but it's not exactly clear what the nature of that relationship is. At least according to the young woman's attorney, we all might speculate as to what the nature of that relationship is. There's certainly a lot of race and gender and class that's rooted in that relationship, right? And expresses itself in the nature of the relationship. But focusing on Donald Sterling, he made comments pretty much in a conversation with her. We can overhear, if you're interested in listening to it on TMZ's website, 15-minute conversation in which he is telling her that he's not pleased that she chooses to pose on Instagram with African Americans. And his concern, as expressed, is that by posing with African Americans, it sends a certain message to the rest of the world. By coming to Clippers games with African Americans, it sends a message to the rest of the world and the rest of the society. And so she, on the other hand, in her conversation with him, says, I don't know, how you were raised. I wasn't raised like how you were raised. I don't hold this racial animus in my heart. I don't dislike black people. I'm half black myself, right? And so she's having this conversation with him about racial animus and conversation about prejudice and a conversation about upbringing. But he's really having a different conversation. He says, it's okay for me to pose in pictures with African Americans. And I don't have anything against African Americans. But you should not be associating with African Americans publicly. He said it's fine if you associate with them privately. You can spend 24 hours a day with black people. You can sleep with black men. That's fine. But don't portray a public persona with black people. And she says, I don't know why you have this bad feeling in your heart. And he says, it's not about me. It's about the rest of the society. And this conversation is like a conversation that goes on in our world today. Because the way some of us understand race is that race is about having an ill feeling in your heart towards a group of people. And that's how she is viewing him. He must have an ill feeling in his heart towards these people. And yet at the same time, he's saying it's not about me, it's about the rest of the society. So he's commenting on he's providing a social narrative about American society. He's providing an analytical tool by which we can understand how race functions in the society. And I want to say he's much closer to the truth than she is. Because the society and the media quickly responded to bring down a penalty upon him because of his comments. He's been banned from the National Basketball Association for life, an unprecedented penalty. He's not allowed to attend game functions. He's not allowed to go to the arena. He's not allowed to be involved with the league. He's not allowed to do anything that is associated with the National Basketball Association. They can't deny him his ownership rights, but they can make it very hard for him. Now, the commissioner can't deny him his ownership rights. Other owners can vote him out. But I want to note that that is problematic to me, not because he shouldn't be penalized or because his comments are not obnoxious. But it's problematic to me that the focus is on removing Donald Sterling from the society. Some people said he just needs to leave the country in some comments. Removing him from the society as if it removes racism from the society. As if the reason we have problems in America is because of people like him. And if it wasn't for people like him, it would all be good. Right? But what he's doing is providing us a lens through which we should understand the social construction of race. Number one, he has gone through a certain racial construction and transformation himself. He was born Donald Tokowitz. He adopted a new name, Donald Sterling, because it allowed him to be more associated with success, he said, and I would say, and less associated with Judaism. Right? So he's whitened his identity. And he's whitened his identity to help him to be more successful. Now, the young lady who is V. Stiviano is her name, in appearance is racially ambiguous. In other words, you look at her and you can't really tell what her ethnic origins are. And with a name like Stiviano, you might think she's from Italy, right? That's the name she changed to. Her name was Maria Perez. It's now V. Stiviano. She has whitened herself. And in whitening herself, she has created a new identity for herself. Race is a social construct. It doesn't exist biologically. If you go down to the level of DNA, you can't find race. You can't find any attribute that is determinative, so that, for example, if your pigment is darker, like mine is, or other members of blacks in this room, you can't then correlate that with lung size, heart size, height, or anything else. It's just a shared pigment, just like blondes have a shared pigment with regards to hair. That doesn't make you a race because you're a blonde. But the reason there is a racial division in our society is because we as a people have given salience to the pigmentation distinction to say that creates a different group of people. And so that salience that we give as a society is not foreign, because a lot of things are socially constructed. For example, the border between Minnesota and, what is that on the other side on the north there? Canada, right? That's socially constructed. If you go out there, you won't see a line in the ice. You won't see a line, right? But we as a group in Minnesota and in the United States have said, this is Minnesota. And the people on the other side have said, this is Canada. And as a result, we've constructed a reality, right? If you try to go back and forth, people say, wait a minute, you can't just necessarily go back and forth, because you have to have certain identity that allows you to be in one place or the other. That's social construction. And so race has been socially constructed. And so both of them, being aware of the social construction of race, have reconstructed their identities to benefit from the meanings that we give to race. And the meanings that race has is not just a matter of any individual's personal bias. But in American society, white represents social dominance. There is a racial hierarchy in American society. It has existed from the time of the conquest versus the natives and the importation of blacks as enslaved Africans in the 1600s and the taking over of the land from Mexico, right? And the immigration laws, which said that you could not, the Immigration Act, Naturalization Act of 1906, said you could not become a naturalized citizen if you were not white. So those laws created a racial hierarchy, because naturalization was necessary to enjoy certain privileges and benefits within the society. And so there were privileges and benefits associated with white racial identity, going all the way back from the 1600s, all the way up through the Naturalization Act of 1906. And what Don Sterling helps us realize, that it didn't end there. It continues today. And you can see it. Social dominance theorists say this: if you look at societies, the group that is socially dominant will benefit and have a higher proportion of wealth, education, superior housing, better food, privilege, status, political power, and less incarceration, less victimization of criminal behavior, less arrests, less poverty, less impoverishment, less dietary limitations, etc., etc., etc. And so if you look at American society, all you have to do is pull out the statistics: the mass incarceration of African Americans, the large illiteracy rates among Native Americans, the disproportionate high school dropout rates with Hispanic Americans, et cetera, and you can see that the material reality of dominance is still very present. It hasn't gone away. It was created as a result of the history of racial segregation and slavery that lasted up and through the 1960s, and all the material benefits and prosperity that inured to people who were white or identified as white remained. The 1964, 1965, 1968 Civil Rights Acts didn't say anything about disgorge all of the material benefits that have been derived as a result of racial segregation. It wasn't required. So even though Bull Connor wasn't allowed to continue to openly segregate people based on race, whatever economic, educational, political, and other benefits inured to the members of the community of Birmingham based on race remained. Right? So social dominance in America is white racial dominance. It's there. It's very much there. So by whitening oneself, one also becomes privy to certain benefits within the society, at least the benefit of not being associated with being the lowest regarded group. So Miss Stiviano, being of Mexican and black identity, finds herself to enjoy the privileges and benefits of being in a strata of American life that she cannot fully enjoy if maybe she is darker, either physically or socially. And Don Sterling is trying to make that point to her. It's not about what I think, it's about what other people think. And so some people might think of him, oh, he's an old bigot, I wish he would just be quiet and go somewhere. And then America would be a multiracial democracy. But that's not the reality. And that's why environmental justice is at the core of environmental ethics. Because the reality is that the problem we experience with the environment is a problem of dominance. It's a problem of dominance. It's a problem of humans dominating the rest of creation. It's a problem of racial groups dominating other racial groups. It's a problem of men dominating women. It's a problem of the wealthy and the middle class dominating the poor. It's dominance all the way down, as we like to say. All the way down. And so how do we then have justice spring up in an environment of dominance? Where does justice come from in an environment of dominance? If our experience of the world is that our struggle to express who we are in terms of our identities requires us to dominate other people in other countries, or the people in our country, or the people in our community, or the grass under our feet, then we have to rethink our expressions of who we are. So, how might we do this? We might begin to do this by coming to understand those who have been dominated. When you look at it in an environmental context, you might think about Papua New Guinea and the OK Teddy mine, which operated for the last 30 years as the largest copper mine in the world. And with the 50,000 members of the community who live downstream from that mine, the 120 villages, and the 500 square miles of environmental devastation that resulted from that mine's operation. That mine has dropped 80 million tons of mine tailings and overburden on those communities and on the OK Teddy River, ultimately transforming the river from its natural characteristics. The indigenous people who live there have had their lifestyles also overburdened and eroded because they can't fish, because the fish are now contaminated and poisoned, and the other animals that eat the fish have also become contaminated. They can't farm because the mine tailings have despoiled the land. And so what can they do? 120 villages, 50,000 people, whose lives are destroyed so we can have copper in our cell phones. Or maybe Tijuana, Mexico, what has been called Machiapolis. And there's a great video on that I want to encourage you to watch by Carmen Duran called Machiapolis, where she tells the story of the 4 million workers and the 1 million workers in the 4,000 factories there on the border of the United States of America, where we have all of these factories, many of which used to be in the United States of America, that have now moved south of the border pursuant to NAFTA, where we have free trade. But as a result of these factories, we also have the pollution of the river that used to sustain life in the community. And we also have the deprivation of the rights of the workers and their exposure to toxic chemicals and harm as a result of their work there. Well, why was it important for factories and corporations to move south of the border? Couldn't they find workers in the United States who would work? Well, of course they could. But they could pay lower wages, and they didn't have to worry about environmental regulation. So they can operate there and destroy the environment in Mexico and preserve the environment in the United States, so that we can have all of the wonderful consumer gadgets that we love. They make a lot of televisions there. I have a television. They make watches there. They make all kinds of things there. Medical equipment that we use here. What does justice have to do with us and them? I'm not a corporation. I'm just a consumer. Or maybe we should think about river states in Nigeria, in the Niger Delta region, which is probably one of the most polluted places on the earth, as a result of the petroleum production that's been going on there since the 1960s, and the utter devastation of the wildlife habitats, of the rivers, and of the wetlands, and of the land, and of the lives of the people who can no longer farm and who can no longer fish. And that's what they did. They were fishers and they were farmers. But they can't fish or farm because the oil is everywhere. 240,000 barrels spilled per year. Devastation, environmental devastation. I have to be honest, I don't have an electric car. My car uses gas, the same kind of gas that's sold by Shell that they get from Nigeria. I don't know. Environmental ethics, if I plant gardens, if I walk to work, if I think properly about human communities and the environment, am I doing environmental justice? Am I practicing environmental ethics? Cancer Alley, Louisiana, right here in the good old United States of America. We find people who live along the fence line and have lived along the fence line for years. If you see a picture of Cancer Alley, you'll see that some of this land is some of the oldest land that has been owned by African Americans since the end of slavery. And that the land was some of the first land that was purchased as soon as people in Louisiana became free. And ultimately, petrochemical corporations all located along this land because of the access to the river. And right next to the playground, right? I mean, when I say next to the playground, closer than I am to President Holmes, is where your massive stacks and petrochemical plants are covering the landscape. And here's the playground, and here's the community. This is where African Americans have lived and continue to live, with all of the fumes and all of the deposition and all of the toxins that come from those petrochemical plants. This is the heart of environmental justice. It's not mostly about what we experience. It's about what people who are lower on the ladder of social dominance experience. The question from environmental ethics is, what does it have to do with us? Well, going back to the beginning of the talk, when I mentioned some of us living lives of quiet desperation, looking for God in our lives, we find God when we find purpose. We find purpose when we become advocates for justice. Isaiah understood way back when Isaiah 58 was being penned. I don't know if it was the first Isaiah, second Isaiah, or Trito Isaiah, right? When it was being penned, that if you want to find God, then what you have to do is fight for justice. If you want to see environmental ethics, fight for environmental justice. How do we do that? How do we fight for environmental justice? 5 simple steps. 1, we have to listen up. We have to engage in conversations and listen to people who are not us. We have to listen to people who we enjoy a gender hierarchy over, a racial hierarchy over, a class hierarchy over, and a species hierarchy over. We're going to have to listen to people who are subordinate to us in our social status. Why? Because they'll bring a different perspective than we have. And it's only from listening to that perspective can we get closer to understanding the reality that we don't live. So we have to listen up. We all have to go on a listening tour to engage with people who we may not regularly engage with. If you're white, you need to talk to some Black and Hispanic folk intentionally and do more listening than talking. You have to. If you want to be for environmental ethics, then you have to consider environmental justice. If you want to consider environmental justice, you've got to get to the heart of social justice and social hierarchy. And that's racial hierarchy and class hierarchy. If you're middle class, like I'm sure all of us are, because all Americans are middle class, you need to work hard to find some working class and some poor people to listen to. Just listen to what they're struggling with, what their lives are like, what they're dealing with, what their environment is like. Just listen to them. And then we have to read up, in addition to listening up. And you're going to have to read some people who you don't normally read. You're going to have to read some deep ecologists. You're going to have to read Peter Singer. You're going to have to read some animal rights activists. You're going to have to read some people who give a perspective maybe that is very distant from yours. Those who are willing to fight and die to save the trees. Not just those who want to enjoy them, but those who are willing to fight and die to save them. You have to read up on what the work of womenist theologians are. You have to read up on what the work of liberation theologians. You have to pull back out Sobrino, pull Gutierrez back out. Read what Latinas are saying about their experiences of the environment. You're going to have to read up on class and remind yourself of the struggle and the fact that rather than middle class people being victims of the class struggle, we're the beneficiaries. When we get tax breaks as middle class folks, let's talk about that mortgage credit. When we get that tax break, that mortgage credit, or we get a business office exemption in our homes, or we get exemptions for certain business expenses that we incur, when we get those, that's money that the government is giving to us. At the same time that food stamp programs are being cut. At the same time that affordable housing is shrinking. At the same time that welfare that is supposed to be given by the government to aid the poor is diminishing, we are looking for bigger tax breaks, right? And we would fight to the death over that mortgage interest deduction, I'll tell you that right now, right? Well, that's a class privilege. That's a class benefit. That's us engaging and benefiting from the subjugation of poor people who can't enjoy those same breaks and those same benefits. So we have to read up, but then we have to speak up. So you have to do what I call disrupt the systems of oppression. After you've gone on a listening tour and after you started reading, you can't stop listening and you can't stop reading. But then you have to start disrupting the systems of oppression. Because the truth of the matter is, Donald Sterling is not the problem with America. Donald Sterling is not the reason we have mass incarceration of African American men. Donald Sterling is not the reason that they build a number of prisons based on a number of black boys in school who can't read by third grade. He has nothing to do with that. Right? That's not the problem. We have to disrupt systems, because it is these systems that is causing the suffering of other human beings. And unless we disrupt the systems, they will continue to cause the suffering. So we have to speak up in our institutions. We have to speak up in our churches. We have to speak up in our businesses. We have to speak up in our homes. We have to speak up in our neighborhoods and our communities. We have to speak up about the injustice in the systems that we are a part of and overturning those injustices. And then we have to act up. We can't just talk, we have to act. We have to vote, we have to send letters, we have to organize campaigns within our churches, we have to inform our congregations that there are more issues at stake than just contraception and the requirement that some businesses have to provide it through the Health Care Act. We have to act up if we want to stop environmental injustice, if we want to have environmental ethics. And then after acting up, we've got to look up. Because the truth is, will we look to the hills from whence cometh our help? Our help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. When we look up, we can find the strength to sustain the fight for justice. Justice is not going to come because we try to use more. I'm going to go right along with my Reinhold Niebuhr 100% here. Moral suasion does not primarily provide justice. Justice requires struggle. We're going to have to fight for what's right. You have to fight for what's right in your homes, in your communities, in your schools. Now, ultimately, some people may be persuaded as a result of you fighting. Look at the civil rights movement. Look at apartheid in South Africa. These are all powerful movements that fought against injustice. And as a result, the morality of the society was shifted. So there's fighting, and fighting can help produce suasion. But ultimately, if we're not going to have to be thrown away as good for nothing, right? What did Jesus say you do with salt that's lost its savor? It's not even fit for the dung heap. All you can do is throw it away. If we're not going to be that kind of throwaway society of people who are endlessly consumed with the shape and the contents of their navels, we're going to have to listen up, read up, speak up, act up, and look up to God from where our help comes. Thank you.